That night, peering out of his dark, cramped vantage point, he could see the entirety of the room. He'd been waiting for hours, waiting for something to happen. Just then, he heard footsteps coming into the room. He leant forward, looking through the hole in the box, and he knew he'd found what he was looking for. On the 26th of February 1887, a representative from the city's Free Trade Hall sat patiently in a chair inside the Manchester Detective Office. The gentleman nervously played with his hat, sliding the rim through his thumb and fingers, rotating the hat round and round to pass the time. He took out his pocket watch to check the time, but just as he did, the door opened and a bearded gentleman called him into the office. The wooden chair creaked under the weight of the gentleman. The bearded man introduced himself as Detective Chief Inspector Jerome Caminada and asked the nervous-looking man how he could be of service. The nervous man introduced himself as Mr. Tennant, the manager of the Free Trade Hall on Peter Street. This building is famous as it was constructed in 1853 on the St. Peter's Fields, which is the site of the Peterloo Massacre, which I will be covering in another video. But also, the Free Trade Hall is a place where on the 14th of April 1868, the Manchester National Society of Women's Suffrage held its first public meeting. Mr. Tennant then went on to inform Caminada that music was continuously being stolen from the concerts being held in the hall, either just before or during the show, and no matter what they tried, the theft had continued with no clue to who or what was taking the sheets of music. Caminada talks at length with Mr. Tennant, and they come up with a plan. A few days later, a large box was delivered to the Free Trade Hall and was placed in the ante-room, and within a few hours, the room was filling with musicians, warming up and tuning their instruments for that evening's concert. At 7:30, the curtain went up and the orchestra played, with amazing grace and skill up until 8:50, when a 10-minute interval was held. The curtain came down and the performers bustled into the ante-room, greeted by a familiar gentleman who offered them drinks while they chatted and tuned their instruments. The break was over and the musicians went back out. The concert was a fantastic success, and the musicians came back into the ante-room to the sound of thunderous applause from the crowd. The familiar gentleman was there again, congratulating them and shaking them by the hand. But yet again, it was discovered that the music had been stolen, but this time, the thief had been discovered. After Mr. Tennant and Caminada devised a plan, Detective Caminada had a large piano box made. He had it made in such a way he could be concealed inside, but let himself in and out with ease when necessary. Holes had been drilled around the box to allow Caminada to view everything that was going on around him. When the piano box was delivered, however, the detective was already concealed inside, this way to avoid being viewed by anyone, as the thief was still unknown. The detective stayed hidden, watching the room while the musicians performed. And just before the interval, the detective noticed an old man appear, just before the musicians came back into the room. And when they left for the second half, the old man was left in sole charge of the room. The detective watched the old gentleman as he saw him become more anxious and looking round cautiously. Caminada saw the man's face. It was the building's librarian. The old librarian placed his hands on the music in front of him, and a huge grin stretched across his face. He looked around the room again and saw the doors were closed and he was alone. He quickly took the sheets of music, folded them and stashed them in his inside pocket. The detective stayed perfectly quiet, watching the man. He stayed in his hiding place as all the musicians filed back into the room, and hurriedly left to enjoy meeting the audience afterwards, leaving the librarian alone again in the room. Caminada thought now was the moment and tried to leap from the box, but something was wrong. The hatch wouldn't move. He pushed and pushed, but it wasn't moving at all. The noise startled the librarian, and he ran from the room. Just then, as he left the room, a gasman walked in, holding his long stick ready to extinguish the lamps. Caminada realised the instruments had been placed against the box, trapping him inside. Realising this was his only chance to avoid spending the night in the box, the detective cried out, "Shift the fiddles!" "Oh my God!" cried the gasman, nearly falling over. The hollow box made Caminada's voice in the dim light seem unearthly. Staring at the instruments now, trembling, he called out, "What was that?" Through his peephole, the detective saw the man was white and looked ready to run. In the sternest voice Caminada could manage, he cried out again, "Shift the fiddles from the piano box, man, and let me out. I'm no ghost, but flesh and blood like yourself." The poor gasman stood there with his hair on end, but obeyed and released the detective from his temporary prison. Relieved to see a man appear from the box, and not a ghost, the gasman sat down, and Caminada sprang from the room to find the trade hall's manager to inform him what he had learnt. With the case closed, the librarian was let go from his post, but the trade hall did not prosecute the old man. Caminada reached out to speak to the gasman, but he refused. Even the manager tried to get him to meet the detective, but he declined, possibly not amused by the shock he had been given. Well, that will do it for today's story. But if you like this one, let me know in the comments below, as it helps me pick the stories that you want to hear. I picked this one as it was a bit different from all the dark stories and murders that I've already collected for the up and coming stories I'll be telling you. If you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe to see my weekly stories that I posted on a Wednesday. And with that will do it. Take care.